Hello and welcome back to the Joe's Art History podcast, a podcast which celebrates all things art historical every single day. It's episode 32 and this week I sit down with the brilliant graphic designer Tilly Haley to discuss what some would claim to be one of the UK's most brilliant designs. I, however, would argue one of the world's greatest designs, the London Underground map. Although the London Underground opened in the 1860s, and it's probably worthy of its own podcast episode, it's the London Underground Chipmap which is taking centre stage today. Although it's been redesigned several times during its long duration, the map we use today has been developed from the original design by a gentleman called Harry Beck, also known as Henry Beck. What's even more interesting is Beck was not a designer, but he was actually an engineer who worked for the Underground and designed the map in his own time, as you do. Although originally knocked back as being too radical, Beck persisted his design would revolutionise how people used and interacted with not just the London Underground, but the transport system in general. And my goodness, was this man correct? Tilly talks us through the design developments of the Underground map before, during and after Beck's time, and we celebrate the legacy of this incredible man who single-handedly revolutionised how we interact with the London Underground system and how he created something so iconic. But it isn't all sunshine and daisies here though. Like any good story, there's of course a few villains thrown in, but you'll learn more about that in the podcast. This is a brilliant chat about one of the world's most iconic maps, which really, actually, isn't a map at all. Are you intrigued? Sit back and relax as Tilly and I discuss Harry Beck, the man who designed the London Underground map. Where did you first come across the topic of the London Underground map and the design of it? Was this something at university? Was it something that you've come across sort of in your working profession?
It was something that, obviously always aware of it, but it was something that I didn't properly start studying and focusing on until my first year at uni. And I can remember we were in like our lectures with, there was obviously us graphics people and then all the other creative courses. And our tutor was like, right, I want you to write an essay on something in your discipline that's really famous, really well known, and really that everyone's kind of fallen in love with. And I was sat there and I was like, well, I know all these like poster designs like Abraham Games and Sol Bass, and I was thinking about all these like really cool people. And then I don't know why, but for some reason Chipmap just came right into my head. And I was like, this is such an iconic piece of design. It's just something that people use every single day. And I think it's just completely underrated. And I think because of that, I was like, this could be like a really interesting topic to write on. And then I remember going to the uni library and I found all these books on the Underground map. And I was like, wow, I cannot believe there can be so much printed material on a map. So I was like, right, I think this is my calling for this essay. So that's kind of where it started. And from writing that essay and doing all my research, I just completely fell in love with it, really. And it just went from there.
Because when you wrote me, Tilly, I was like, oh, the London Underground. And then you sent me this really beautiful paragraph of just explaining why you wanted to talk about it. And I was like, gosh, you're right. It is just this one, just like what you said, completely iconic thing. And it's hidden in plain sight. Mm-hmm. We use it, particularly me, I live in London. I use it when the world is working, of course. I use it almost every day. And it's so iconic worldwide and something that you don't ever stop and think, someone had to design that. Someone had to sit down and think, how can we portray this across to people? And what I love from diving into this topic, like you said, when you found the books, I was like, oh my gosh, how much is on this? I have found some very passionate people and this amazing, very sassy blog post about one of the designers, which I'll bring up a little later on. But people love it. It's amazing. People are so passionate about the history of this iconic piece of design. And it is, but it was something that what we see today is not how it started.
No, not at all. And I think when I first like messaged you and I was like, oh, this would be a really cool topic to talk about. Afterwards, I was like, okay. I was worried I kind of set myself up for a fall because I was like, we've got all like the technical design elements of it. But then as I actually started to research it, there is so much history behind it and how it has come to be what it is today. And I think again, it's like I said, it's one of those things that people don't really appreciate that much, but people don't really understand the history behind it, let alone even the man that designed it. And I think, which I think is really sad for something that's so recognizable. But yeah, the history behind it is just, and how Harry Beck came to his decisions and how he designed it is really, really fascinating, I think. And it's much more than just a design piece. It's much more historical than that, I think.
Yeah, and also before we even, pressed record on this, you and I were both in agreement that this is a great story and actually it should be a movie. So any Netflix people
Absolutely.
get in touch. We will write the screenplay. And I'm telling you, you think the Queen's Gambit is good. Wait till you hear this story.
I think this could be blockbuster material, I think.
It could be. It's such a good story. It's got heroes, it's got villains, it's got everything. Okay, so you've very briefly mentioned Mr. Beck. So who is Harry Beck, Henry Beck? I mean, I see that he's referred to in like two or three different. I've got Harry Beck or Henry Beck.
I think from what I researched, he was christened, or his birth name was Henry, but I think everyone shortened it to Harry. So
right,
I'm gonna go by Harry. I think it's a Harry Beck.
Okay.
But he was. It's really sad in the. I find it sad in the way that because he never really got the fame and recognition he deserved until after he passed away, which sadly is the case for a lot of people. I know definitely in the art world that was the case a long time ago. And I think because of that, there's not much really known about his personal life and how he came to be as an employee of the Underground Company. So Mr. Harry Beck was born on 4th of June 1902 in London, and he ended up working for the London Underground Signals Company as the engineering draftsman. And I think having this role, his job was primarily to draw the schematics for electrical systems for the Underground. So because of his technical drawing background, I think it has a massive impact on how he designed the London Underground map. Because when I found out what he actually did for a job, I had no idea what any of them words meant. And I Googled a schematic illustration, and it was so reminiscent of what the Underground map is. And the reason he actually went on to design the Underground map was because he was made redundant from the Underground Company. And this designing the Underground map was something he did in his spare time. And I think that avenue that he took with his job to then design the Underground map is very visual within his map. You can see that was his background and in his drawing. But I find, again, it's quite sad that nothing really more is kind of known about him, because he wasn't very well known again before he passed away. So that's him, really.
I think this is always just sort of like, case in point of an example of someone who has made an iconic contribution to the world, because this is world reaching, and we will get onto that. But he took something that wasn't working and just had a passion for designing something to help people. And it's just a very simple design, process of, who are you designing it for? Okay, let's keep it simple. It doesn't have to be this big, huge, complicated thing, because that's essentially his starting point, was the initial London Underground map. When you sent me a photo of this, I could have thrown up. I was like, that is so complicated.
Oh, it's so awful. And I think, I really truly think that Beck was probably one of the first people to, within design, that actually thought about his audience when he was designing. Because now this is something that we think about every single day, and it's like, within my job, it's like, we've got to think about the client. And it's so easy to just go away with yourself and think, oh, this looks amazing. But I think Beck was probably one of the first people that actually considered what the audience would want and how to make it recognisable for them. Because I mean, prior tube maps to the one he designed were just a bit of a state, to be quite honest.
Because the tube itself, like I think the first underground stop opened in like, you know, the 1880s or something like that. So, you know, the tube had been around for quite a while. And then, I mean, do correct me if I'm wrong, and then in sort of 1908, 8 independent companies sort of merged together, and then that kind of became the underground. But they were all sort of individual underground lines, and they weren't even called the underground essentially. And then they all came together. But the map, the first map of the London Underground that you've shared with me, this blew my mind because it's essentially just lines. It's a geographical map. So it's showing you how the lines work essentially on top of a foot map, you know, what you would use if you're driving or if you're walking.
Yes, absolutely. So this first map was published in 1908, and the underground company at the time was completely at a loss for money. It was in complete financial crisis, basically. And the underground company had, the very first line was the Metropolitan Railway, which opened in 1863. And by the time 1908 came along, I think, as you said, there were 8 different railway lines. The underground company had bought them, and they were also in the process of building 3 more underground lines. And this was when, I can't remember what the guy's name was, but the underground company were bought out by this man who said, right, you've got 6 months to completely transform this and get the underground sorted, because it was completely in a financial mess. So this first map was commissioned in 1908 by a man called Frank Pick. This was probably one of the very first things that he commissioned at his time for the underground company. And he went on to be one of the most important people behind the underground company, without a shadow of doubt. He completely revolutionised it. So the underground became what I would call a brand, because he commissioned this map, but he didn't just commission the map, he made underground artwork really important to try and get people to use the underground. He was the man that commissioned the design of the underground typeface. He was a really, really important guy. And so his idea was, by putting all these lines together on an underground map, was going to make people want to use the map more, because it was a bit more accessible and a bit more understandable, and all these lines were connecting, and it ultimately made London look so much more accessible with all these lines and with this map that he commissioned. However, you can tell it is definitely the first map that was ever designed, because it is so complicated, and I really do not understand how anyone managed to find their way around London with it, to be quite honest.
For me, what I find so interesting, I mean, going back to this guy, because I think this is also the gentleman that commissioned, and it's when the first time that the very sort of, you know, the round symbol for underground, was this not him as well?
He was behind all of this kind of design development, behind the brand, yeah.
Which is so iconic today. But yeah, going back to his first map, I mean, you know, standing ovation for a solid first attempt. But it's so heavily concentrated on the centre of London that half of the stations don't even fit.
No, I think, and I mean, bless this guy. I feel a bit bad because I don't actually know the person that legit designed this map. So Frank Pick's going to get all the criticism on this one. Sorry. But yeah, it's half of the places didn't fit, and it was just an absolute state. Yeah, it was so complicated. I mean, at least he got the coloured lines right. I mean, that was one, he could have taken it one step further and had them all the same colour or something. But yeah, by having, I think this was the only map that's been designed on a legit proper geographical map, which I'm pretty pleased that went out the window quite soon. But yeah, it was just so complicated. But I mean, fair play, because if this guy hadn't have stepped up and said, we need a map of all the lines, we wouldn't have known Harry Beck as he is today. So,
well, that's it. And there's, there's nothing wrong with taking some. I mean, that's some of the best thing, some of the best design concepts. You take something that's already invented and you go, okay, how can you streamline this? And that's essentially what Harry Beck did. But there was someone that came before Harry Beck that worked on Pick's first map that was made. Fred Stingmore.
Yeah. So yeah, he then I think he was then recruited because Frank Pick was then made commercial manager in 1912 after his success of building up the brand. So this Fred Stingmore guy worked for Frank Pick in the publicity manager's office. So he was known to him. Mm. And Fred Stingmore was already considered quite an expert in his field, because he'd already had a lot of work to do with the publicity material of the posters and things, and had already had quite a lot of input into that. But it's a shame because people remember Harry Beck, and because of him, everyone kind of forgets about what Fred Stingmore did before. He'd kind of started to simplify the map really ready for Beck, because he'd got rid of the map, the geographical map, and started to realise that it doesn't have to be geographically accurate for people to use it, really. And I think his idea was that he wanted to make London appear so much more accessible. So his plan was he wanted to make London appear much more to the people that were in like the outer boroughs of London, and make them feel like they were still definitely part of the London community, really. So I definitely think his input, again, was fundamental to what Beck went on to do.
Well, that's it. And I think it's really important to remind people, we're talking about the turn of the 1900s here. This really, this was 20 years, not even after, things like the Jack the Ripper attacks. And, I was watching a video in preparation for this, and anyone that's interested, I'll leave it below. And it was about how they used to mine the tunnels in London, and they could only essentially do 4 inches a day. That's how little progress they made in a day.
I didn't know that, jeez.
And the progress of the London Underground building, or making rather, was so painfully slow. There were still slums in, Spitalfields and, Whitehall, these sorts of places where people could essentially migrate to King's Cross, which was kind of like one of the first really big stations. But like you said, the whole idea of the Underground was to encourage people and show people that London was accessible. You can use this. And for a long time, I don't even think until I think 1903, 1904 was when they first started using electricity on most of the lines, so there's a whole history there of things that and developments as well. I read something about, my goodness, about the doors as well, I think until about 1915, maybe a bit later, that all the doors in the Underground were still manually operated. So when you stopped at a stop, you had to physically open the doors yourself. All these things, all these designs and improvements, there's always something to work on, and there's always just exactly what Beck did with any good design. You can take the original concept and how can you streamline it. But yeah, so Fred Stingmore, sorry to go off on a bit of a tangent. So he's taken away sort of the geographical map of the first one, and he's kind of got away with all that sort of detail. But more importantly, there's far more names on this map. There's far more stations.
Yes, there are definitely a lot more. So he also decided that, again, with the lack of geographical accuracy, you could actually space the names along the lines a little bit more. So again, it's kind of this thing of making everyone feel closer to London. So I think with this idea, and so by reducing the map but making the lines longer and making the names space out a little bit more, it definitely did help to make the map a little bit more accessible, I think. However, you can still see it, the edges of the lines, like the edge of the circle line, the top left corner, there's still no way that he was going to get all those names on. And he's got them all in the little boxes, which I think, it still had a long way to go, but I definitely think that this guy helped, again, like with this progression thing, I definitely think that he helped probably make Beck's job a little bit easier by some of these things that he had started to put into his own work.
Well, that's it. And like you said, he's tried to space out all the words. I can't help but be drawn to the absolute jumble of words that is in the centre of the map.
Yeah.
Places like Regent's Park, Oxford Street, Tottenham Court Road, they've just, and Euston Square. They've even put landmarks on there, actually, like the British Museum, which I hadn't seen previously. That's quite exciting. So this was the idea. So let's move on to Beck's interpretation.
Beck's first idea was put forward to the Underground Company in 1931, and again, with the whole electrical background that he thought he could really develop this map into something a lot more practical. So it's kind of more information design really than graphics. But his main things that he wanted to bring into this map were he wanted to straighten all of the lines out to make it more of an electrical idea diagram. He wanted to bring in diagonal lines because it was going to help ultimately fit more of the stations into the map by having these lines going off at different angles. And he also wanted to even the stations out properly and a little bit more mathematically, so they definitely did have more space between all the stations. So he put this forward in 1931. Obviously, this one is the one that ended up getting published, I think. But he took it to them in 1931, and the Underground Company rejected it. No questions. They were just like, no, it's far too radical. We really, really don't like it. Absolutely no way we're going to use this. But he had a lot of friends and supporters around him that were like, no, you can do this. Like, keep going, because we really, really think that there is something in this. And I think as well, because with Fred Stingemore's map, while it was developing a little bit, it's worth noting that they had to actually put a geographical map next to his little pocket maps because people were still so confused by what his map was showing them. So I think Beck definitely had something with this idea. So Beck carried on working on this map for 2 years until 1933, when he took it back to the Underground Company, and he was like, I revised it, it looks really cool. And they eventually gave in to him, because I think he was very, very, very persistent, and I don't blame him at all. And they originally gave him a run of 500 copies to give out to people to see what they thought. And people were generally quite warm about it. They thought it was quite a nice idea. So on that generally quite nice feedback, they paid him £10 for his design, which is £10, which apparently would work out about £600 today. But he was paid for his map, which just seems completely crazy now when you think what the map has become.
Just a bit mean if you think about it, like classic having a great idea and your boss is taking
yes, absolutely. And you just got to feel sorry for him, really, because you kind of almost get this gist of like a class system thing going on, where he had his job as electrical engineer and they were all like, no, it's not going to work. And then it's just really sad, really, I think.
Yeah, but going back to something you said earlier about, what inspired his idea, the whole idea of like a circuit and schematics when you're doing engineering and when you're looking at electricals, what it reminded me of, and how, for anyone that can't really picture it, the simplest way I could kind of describe what inspired it was, do you know when you're in science at school and you do circuits, so you'll have a battery, and the diagram will show you the battery, a very straight line, something else in the middle, like a potato, because in Scotland we use potatoes, and then another line, and then you attached it to the light bulb. And the whole idea is to show that the electricity will run straight through and power the light bulb. And that is, it's so obvious when you see these sorts of diagrams, what inspired him. And he used something that, engineering, not design, engineering, to apply it to a map system, because maps are incredibly important. And this map is incredibly important because it tracks not only the development of the city, but it's like how it expanded, how people used it. The more people that were using the underground, the more money these places had to sort of pump into design and think, and employ people to think like this. So for anyone thinking, I don't really see the point in this, it's incredibly revolutionary, and something that hasn't not just been sort of like far-reaching England-wise. Beck's design has been taken and revolutionized underground systems in places like Tokyo, Berlin, Sydney, Washington, DC. They all come back to Beck's design because it just makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just so groundbreaking. I think groundbreaking is probably the right word, because no one had really seen anything at this time. And I think as well, it's also worth noting, a lot of people don't call this graphic design. They call it information design. And I think, and a diagram, a lot of people don't call it a map, which I think is quite interesting.
Oh, I'd never thought of it like that before. Information design. But I don't know. Well, the thing is though, because I think colloquially, if we call it the Chipmap. How interesting that people, are you meaning like comparing to what a normal map looks like, a geographical
Yes, I
map
think
looks
so,
like?
because I think that's why a lot of people have now started to refer to it as a diagram, because it is so geographically, because a map is
Ah,
associated with geography and everything, which is actually a really good point. I never thought of it like this before. It was always the tube map, but actually when you think about it, it is, and again with the electrical science background, it is much more of a diagram.
yeah, you're right. But that's just what we call it. We call it the tube map. But maybe, well, there's always one that bends the rules, though,
Yes,
isn't
there
there?
is. There is. I will continue to call it a tube map anyway.
Yeah, well, that's it. It just feels wrong to call it. Oh, do you have the tube diagram on you? It just doesn't.
No, it didn't as well.
This isn't right. So okay, so Beck's design was a hit, and the Underground decided to commission it essentially, and he was paid a very measly sum of £10. So, what happened once his design was up and running? Was that it, or where did Beck take it from there?
So the map. So once he got given this initial run of 500 maps, they gave it a proper print run of 750,000 maps, and all the maps were taken within a month. Everyone just absolutely loved it. It was a massive hit, and generally people absolutely just loved it, and it was just a much better way of getting around London. So that was 1933, and he continued to go on and design the map for the next nearly 30-ish years until 1960. But obviously, as with any design, it has to be updated, because there's however many more underground lines that have. It's interesting looking at this map now and thinking about the map we do have today, and think about how many more lines have been added. So over the next 30 years, the Underground Company commissioned Beck to not just add extra lines and adapt it into the diagram we had. They thought that they could add new design tweaks to it, which didn't really work, but Harry Beck tried his utmost to add them in and make them as seamless as possible. There are so many that I could go on forever adding photos to this of maps that didn't work. But there's two examples which were just pretty bad. And these examples, literally within a year or so of them being commissioned, they were up, and the Underground Company had gone back to something that Beck had designed, one of Beck's original designs, because nobody liked them. But one of the first examples was in 1935. They decided that they wanted to make the central part of London on the map really, really chunky lines. We're talking like almost 3 times the width of the lines that are there at the moment, which again, I don't know if it's maybe an elite thing, central London, but it almost kind of went against this idea of making London inclusive for everyone. And I'm not sure why they did it. I think they just wanted to make it more noticeable where the central hub of London is. But it just looked really, really ugly. But that was one that was really bad. And then the second one, they decided that they wanted to get rid of all the 45-degree lines, and which it definitely didn't work. And they put them at an angle which was like, it basically allowed them to squish the map. So the lines were going more vertical, which meant that they could squish the map and allow, because I think that this was the time when the central line was being extended. And I mean, we all know how long the central line is, and that is just literally through the width of London. And they wanted to make sure they get all the stations on there. So they thought that by doing that, they just squish the map, change the 45-degree lines. And again, it was just an absolute disaster. And over the next 30 years, Beck did everything that they asked, but it was just never popular, and they always ended up going back to the very first, or a development of the very first map that he really designed.
So he's working on this map continuously for 30 years, as you've said. And then this is where I had this has to be a movie. 1960 enters, and we meet the villain of the tale, really. And this is a gentleman called Harold Hutchinson.
I think this is a really good thing, actually, to talk about him before the drama, because at first, when I read about all that kicked off, I was like, oh my God, you horrible person. Like, you're such a evil man. Without using a worse word. But actually, like, when you go into his background and what he did, he was again, he was kind of like the next Frank Pick, as it were, in terms of developing the brand. So he was employed as...
I think he was... What was Pick's job? He worked in the publicity.
Yes,
he
that was
the
it. And I think
officer.
He was employed in 1947 to the Underground Company, which at that time, obviously London was in complete disarray with the end of the Second World War. Morale was really low. And so he had a mighty job on his hands trying to rejuvenate the underground identity and the underground brand. So he came on board in 1947, and he was really, really important in revitalising the poster art post-war. That was kind of his first thing that he really came in to work on with the Underground Company. Obviously, there was very, very little money that the Underground Company could spend. But he'd already had a background in advertising, because he used to be on the advertising and copy team for Unilever, which I think, again, he's got a very advertising head on his shoulders. And he came into the Underground Company, and he knew what he wanted to do, and he knew the tough job he had ahead of him. So he was really, really behind the idea of art for all. And he actually commissioned an exhibition at the V&A that celebrated 40 years of underground artwork at the end of the 40s, beginning of the early 50s. And so he, in some ways, this guy was pretty good in actually bringing art to the masses and actually making people, encourage people to get spending again on the underground, and encourage them that the underground's safe. And it's a modern way of just completely modernising it, really. And again, with his very limited spending that he had, he didn't have many design. He couldn't afford to employ a lot of people to do this poster design. But the people he did employ, he knew were going to be good, and he knew that they were going to do a good job. So he was a very ruthless man, I would say, but he knew how to get the job done, ultimately.
Well, that's it. And, you know, like you said, you have to remember this is at a time where, you know, not just Britain, but the world was like reeling from World War II. People were physically terrified to come back into London. They didn't think it was safe. There was also talks of another war happening. Rationing was still on the go. You know, this was a really, really difficult time across the board in Britain. And that is not an easy task to be told, hi, you're going to single-handedly try and encourage people to get back spending and get on, explore London again. Just ignore all the bomb sites. Yeah, so I'm glad that you've painted him in a very sort of in a good light. However, in terms of Team Harry Beck, I'm firmly on Team Beck for this.
Absolutely. So Hutchinson had, while he was very nice and very cooperative with the people that he did like, if he didn't like you, then you didn't really have a leg to stand on. There was one example of the poster artist that he did work with. There was an artist called Mona Moore. She submitted some work to him, and his response was so blunt and so curt. And all he sent back to her was, I think this might work out, but at the moment, I simply cannot fit it into our programme. However, I will remember you are back in action. It was like, oh, okay. So I think that's quite important in seeing, while people loved him, he was also a bit down the line, really, with who he didn't like. So yes, so going back to being Team Beck, which we obviously are, Hutchinson decided that in 1960, well, at the time, it was kind of more, he hadn't decided, it was a case of the map needed updating again with new additions to tube lines. And Hutchinson decided that he would design the underground map himself, which is just completely unthinkable when Beck has been doing this for 30 years and Hutchinson steps in and is like, I can do a better job, which I think we can prove he definitely didn't. But I think it's the way that Hutchinson went about this that is the most shocking thing. I mean, yeah, if you want to design a map, that's fine. But the way Beck was treated as someone that had designed this map for 30 years and had really put his ownership onto it is really quite heartbreaking, I think. And yeah, absolutely gutting. It can all be a little bit woolly as to what exactly was said and what exactly happened. But in 1937, Beck had signed over the copyright of the map to the Underground Company. But there was also a gentleman's agreement with a man called Christian Barman, who was Harold Hutchinson's predecessor, that Beck would be in charge of undertaking all future work on the map. And his name would always appear, and this was solely going to be his thing, even though Underground Company had the copyright. Within a couple of months of that agreement, someone else had already been employed to make amends to Beck's map. So this underhandedness had been going on right through Beck's 30-year ownership or work of the map. But again, within a couple of years, Beck was back on track. And I think that was about it from 1941 to 1960. No, I don't think anyone else really touched the map apart from Beck. So when Hutchinson stepped in, it's believed that Beck was kept completely in the dark about this map, and Hutchinson did it in absolute secrecy. Now, some people have said that Beck wasn't the easiest person to work alongside because he was quite protective of what he'd done. And so some people wonder, was that why Hutchinson produced this map in secrecy? But what I've heard, and this is a couple of accounts of this, and obviously it's an account, I don't know how true this is, but it's believed that the first time Beck realised that his map had been redesigned by somebody else was when he was travelling on the Underground and he saw the map at the station, which is just absolutely gutting. If you've spent 30 years on a map and then you find out someone's just completely redone it, it's really sad. But yeah, so I think Hutchinson had been wanting to develop the map through a lot of the 1950s, and Beck just didn't really agree with what Hutchinson wanted. And I think there's a picture I sent you of Beck with his electrical diagram. The map in the background of that picture is the last one that Beck ever designed. And that was his favourite map, in his opinion, that he'd ever done. And you can see by that map that a lot of the diagonals had been taken out and the design had just generally evolved. So when Hutchinson came on board, he wanted to bring all the diagonals back, but Beck didn't want to because he really liked how his new diagram was looking. And Hutchinson just generally felt that Beck wasn't really going to develop it anymore, and he just thought that Beck's work was really a bit of a dead end. So Hutchinson came in, we did the map in absolute secrecy. Beck found out while he was travelling on the Underground, and the sad thing as well is that because Hutchinson had built up a lot of alliances within the Underground Company, because again he treated people that he liked fairly and well, everybody backed Hutchinson and nobody stuck by Beck at all when this new map came about. And even going back to the man Christian Barman, who he made this agreement with, Barman actually stepped forward and said, we never made an agreement. And Beck he threatened legal action, but just nobody stood by him. And it's really sad because I think he continued to fight Hutchinson on this for 4 or 5 years. And in the end, he just stepped back and just gave up. And it's a really, really sad end to someone that had been so fundamental in revamping the Underground map, really.
Well, that's it. And essentially, did Hutchinson not, what I've read anyway, was he not the one that he's known famously as letting Beck go. He essentially fired Beck because there was just so
Yes,
much
absolutely.
sort of tension there.
Yeah, he is known as, I think the blog post or the article that I've been reading, I don't know if it's been the same one as you, but it's called "The Man Who Sacked Harry Beck."
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
It is so
sassy as I
sassy.
love it.
Yeah, so he is known as the man that basically ended his career with the underground. But I think Beck can take some comfort in the fact that Hutchinson's map only lasted 2 years because it was so negative and people just hated it so much that they ended up ditching it in the end anyway.
Well, karma, that's what came to mind when I read that. But I also think it's very interesting that, Beck was so resistant to try and, I mean, it's that classic case of you sometimes become so close to a project, you can't see any ways of developing it and making it better. Because if I'm looking at the photo that you've sent me of Beck with that map in the background, and for anyone listening, all the images will be on my Instagram. And I also make YouTube videos. So if you're listening to this on YouTube, you should be looking at it now. The map in the background, I would say, I mean, controversial, Hutchinson's design is a bit more readable. I mean, it's fine. I get Beck's map. There's a lot of very sort of vertical, horizontal lines. There's not a lot of 45-degree angles, but Hutchinson's map is way more similar to the map that I use today, that we use today. So yeah, so I don't think it's all bad. I just think it's more how he's gone about it is shady and really disrespectful for someone that you're supposed to admire and has made this
Absolutely. I
amazing
think because
contribution.
looking at Hutchinson's map, and obviously it got so much bad press, but when you do compare it when you actually do look at it as a diagram, it could have been a lot worse. He could have really like taken it to town and done something completely awful. But I do agree with you. I think that it's actually not too bad, and I think there are elements of Hutchinson's map that have actually gone on to be that did actually go on to be in future maps afterwards.
So from this article, it says there are three fundamental and lasting changes to the map that Hutchinson's made that we apparently still use. So he differentiated between interchanging stops on the underground lines with a circle, which we use, which is true. Whenever you can cross into a different station or two stations meet, there's always a circle. He used upper and lower case letters for the first time, making stations' names easier to read and adding an emphasis to interchanging stations, which are still capitalized on the map today. And then this gets very boring. So most significantly, he sought to make his own map more relevant to what was going on above ground. His principal objection to the latter versions of Beck's design was that an increasing reliance on 90-degree angles alone had made the map too abstract. For example, from 1954, all Beck's maps showed both northern branches of the northern line pointing due north, so essentially a vertical straight line. Whereas in reality, they veered northwest. I mean, that's just tripping up over details, but hey, I'm not a designer. Hutchinson's tried to remedy this on his map, and he had a point. Not one of his successors has returned to Beck's final vision of horizontal and vertical lines set at 90-degree angles to one another, with as few 45-degree diagonals as possible, which sounds very wordy. But when you compare both maps, it's true, Beck really did love a vertical line, whereas this very much kind of flows with a geographical map, but it's still straight lines, but it's not 90 degrees and 45 degrees. There's a bit of movement. You move with the geography, if you will. So I do get that. But when I read that, I was like, whoa, people really love details like this, like really love.
Yes, it definitely does get very technical when you look at those descriptions of analysing little bits and pieces like that. Definitely.
So we've spoken about Hutchinson's map, and his map lasted 2 years, and then he had a successor called Paul Garbett. And essentially, in this article that you and I have both read, I love the line where he says he felt that he had clutched the map back from Hutchinson's ham-fisted parody of Beck's design. So people were really passionate about this London Underground design. It's amazing. And what I couldn't actually find very much on Paul Garbution.
There's not too much about him because Harry Beck's our main guy, and I mean there isn't even that much about him. But Paul Garbutt, again, I think this is interesting because he came into it in a very similar way that Harry Beck did to the Underground Company. So he joined the London Transport Company in the late 1940s, and his position at the company was to do with the planning of the railway lines. So he actually worked on some really important projects while he was there, including the planning of the Jubilee line, the Victoria line, and the Heathrow extension of the Piccadilly line. So outside of the map, he'd already had a really, really impressive career in how the underground scientifically works. And again, he ended up designing this design out of complete boredom, similar to Beck. And because he'd heard so much criticism about Hutchinson's map, he decided that I think it was over a Christmas break, and he was really bored and just decided to take Hutchinson's map, take the good bits still of Beck's map, and make it his own and design this map that we have today. But also which I found really, really interesting, was the fact that he was involved with consultancy work worldwide and helped to set up the London Transport International, which basically this company aided the design of metro and subway services throughout the world. And without Paul Garbutt, I don't think we would see underground maps across the world as we do today, because without him spreading all his knowledge of Beck's design, then I think a lot of these maps, I mean, with the exception of the Paris underground map, because I know that Beck, before he passed away, had actually spent quite a lot of time, in fact decades, trying to perfect the Paris metro map. I'll get there eventually. But in regards to like all the other ones, I think that was mainly Paul Garbutt's work, that he'd established this design going international, really.
I just think that it's just amazing, because you just don't think something like an underground map would be so far reaching. And this is what I've loved about it. Like, it's this huge internet. But even when I think about it now, when you think of London as a snapshot, you think of the London Underground symbol, you think of red buses, you think of red telephone boxes. You know, it's part and parcel of quintessential London. Oh, we're gonna get the tube, we're gonna get the underground. It's just amazing. It isn't it like, oh, this has been so fascinating. So Paul essentially is the sort of the guy to thank for taking this.
Yes, I believe he is. I think it was his brainwork and his knowledge that helped to take it to other countries.
Oh, was it Paul, or was it because essentially what's different if we're looking at this map is that it has this grid system overlaid. And so this means there was like an index system where if say you wanted to go to Green Park, or you needed to find where Green Park was, you would look in the index, it would tell you it's on F4, and you would go flip the map over and you'd go to F4, and then you'd find where you need to go, which is kind of what happens on geographical maps. That's the sort of system that you use there. So they're kind of, and Hutchinson's had this as well in his, so they're kind of, although it's not geographical, they are incorporating things to help you, you know, elements of geographical maps to help you find the information quicker than just staring at it until
yes, definitely. And I think as well, clever. Having said that, going back to, because of course we're Team Beck, going back to the black and white image of Beck and the map in the background, I think if you look faintly at that, there's the grid system on the back of there as well.
Oh, so there is. You can see it really, really faintly. You can see
which
ABC
I've never noticed
very
before,
faintly right
but
at the top.
I think, so that must have come in during Beck's time.
Well, it makes total sense though, because if you're a tourist coming to London, or you're coming to, you need to get to a certain tube stop to find a job, you're going to a job interview, the last thing you want to do is, spend 20 minutes, because there's a lot of information, even in Beck's day, there's a lot of stations, there's a lot of information on that map. So again, going back to what you said earlier, he's really thinking about to make something user friendly, which is essentially what this map is. It's not complicated. I mean, I don't get me wrong, when I first moved to London, I was like, whoa, that's a lot of colors and a lot of names.
First time I went to London, like on my own, like with friends and stuff, and I was, oh my God, what is this? Like, but once you kind of get to know it, it's probably one of the most simple design, or not simple designs, but one of the most simply like navigational things ever. Like, it's so easy to use.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I think like anything, it looks very intimidating when you kind of first step up to the board. But one thing I loved as well, that I don't think we've mentioned, is that, Harry Beck's maps, they were printing, pocket maps for people to take with them. It wasn't, as well as publicizing tube maps in all the stations, as well as what you see when you're in a tube car as well. Because from what I understand, for a little while, you just kind of had to know what stop you were getting off at. There was no announcement that said, we're getting off, oh, next stop is Oxford Circus. They didn't have all that. So it really
Yes,
has come
I never
a
even
long
thought of this
way.
before, actually. If you went on the tube and you didn't have the pocket guide, that's crazy. That's never even come to mind before. But yeah, I
Hmm.
think with Beck's kind of input, I think all of these things, and over time, all of these things have developed, and I think it has just become a general more user friendly piece of design, really.
Yeah, and total experience as well. It's just amazing. But what I really, really love in the last few examples that you've sent me is that you've really showed how much people have embraced the underground, and not just art for the underground, but fun poster designs, but also how the
Mm,
underground in itself is so iconic. You don't even really need to, you can just suggest the colors and you instantly know, oh yeah, that's the tube map, which I think so fascinating. And I think one that I loved when you sent this to me, I never would have found this, was an
yes.
advertisement for the tube with or the
Yes. So,
Tate.
in fact, it was only after I sent it you and I read the caption at the bottom, and it's the Tate Gallery by Tube, and I was like, I just love that description because is it by the Tube, or is it getting to the Tate Gallery by the Underground Tube? I was like, that was just me being really geeky and sad, but yes, this
Oh, it's
poster was
so good.
designed
It's
by
so good.
David. I think his name's David Booth. And this was, I think, late 80s, early 90s. This poster was designed, but in fact, it's become one of the best. I think it's actually the best-selling
Mm.
underground poster for the London Transport Museum, which just shows how awesome this design is. But it's this idea that Beck's design, and obviously other designers have adapted it over time, but still going back to it being Beck's, without Beck's intuitive design, you would never have, like, if that was just like a thing of squiggly lines like the first map, you would think, what's that? But because his diagram is just so iconic, I think when
Yeah.
you just see it on this poster, it's just so cool. And I think if if anyone does want to see this, this is on at the they've actually got this on display at the London Transport Museum, and I think it was made out of plastic, and they've actually got the piece that David Booth made that he then photographed and for this map, and it's just so cool. I just love it. I just wish I could come up with something like this.
But that's it. It's so clever, and that's really what this is. And even, we were saying this before we started recording. Even if you took away, so it has a little paint tube that essentially, and on the paint tube it has the London Underground symbol, and then it says Pimlico. Which, for anyone listening that has never been to London or doesn't know London, Pimlico is where you get off to go to Tate Britain, and it's on the Victoria line. And so for me, when I looked at this, I was like, oh, this must have been designed to, when the Tate opened or when the Pimlico tube opened. And it wasn't. So the Pimlico tube station opened in 1972, but Tate, which was actually originally called the Museum of British paintings, the Museum of British Art, opened in 1897. So this was just another example of, so it wasn't even to mark anything, it was just to encourage people to use the underground, and but also to go and experience
it's such
London.
a cool poster, and I can so
it.
see why it has become as popular as it has. I think it's just so cool. I just absolutely love it. I can't actually put into words how cool I think it is.
Yeah, it's just really clever. And just even if that paint tube wasn't there, I think if you ask most people, what do you think this is? It's a London-based thing. I think most people would be like, oh, it's the underground, because that circle line, which actually looks like a bottle, is so iconic. Oh, I love it. I think it's great. But then you also sent me something even better. Well, this is excellent, but then you sent me something else, which another very iconic moment in London's very recent history, of course, is
yes. So
the 2012
this was
Olympic
a poster
Games.
series designed by a designer called Denise Jacobs. And she only initially designed this as, well, she was commissioned by Transport. I think it was Transport for London commissioned it. And the initial poster was just having the 5 gold rings in the middle, but it sold out like immediately. So she then produced this other series of the silver and the bronze ones. And in fact, I've got the silver poster. It sits at the foot of my bed. Poster art from the London Transport Museum. They make artwork and posters so accessible and so reasonable. And it's really nice to be able, because I mean, obviously being a graphics person, I love any posters, and especially like transport posters, I just absolutely adore. But yeah, I think I got this for like £10 in Black Friday. Like, it was like, for something that's like so iconic. I think I do like the way that they make it so accessible for people to own a poster. But no, I got it, and it sits at the bottom of my bed. So it's one of the first things I see in the morning when I wake up. And I was just, after I'd said to you about the podcast, I was looking at it and I was like, it's just, again, just so iconic, because the 5 lines that she's used to make the medals are the 5 underground lines that connected people to the main venues of the Olympics. And again, I think just by having those 5 lines coming in, you just know what they are. And I just think it's such a simple piece of design, but it's just so, there's just something, simple design is always the most effective, I think.
Yeah, timeless. I would say it's timeless, because you just know, and you don't have to be from London. But going back to what you said about sort of the accessibility thing of it, this is incredible, because this is a limited edition series of posters. As you said, the gold poster ring sold out, and they only have a limited number of silver rings and bronze rings in this design. And the Transport Museum, for anyone listening, still has a very small selection of these posters available. So I'm looking at it now, and you can get it online. You can get 10% off your first order, and it's 20 quid. We're not sponsored by London Transport Museum. I'm just saying, if you've been, inspired by this chat and you think, oh yeah, do you know what, that would be a really cool thing to have, I'm just telling you where you can find it. But also, the London Transport Museum online archive is incredible. Like you were saying a little bit earlier, there are so many different maps that have come both before and after and during Beck's reign as London Underground Map King, and which is not the official title, just in case anyone's listening to this for like research reasons. That is not the title, of course, but although maybe it should be, that would be great. Anyway, yeah, their online archive of vintage of maps is incredible. Even when London used to have trams, it shows you all the tram maps and things. It's brilliant. So I would say, and we were saying before I recorded, I'll hold my hand up, I've never been to the London Transport Museum. I know exactly where it is. It's in Covent Garden. It's a very iconic spot in London. It's just never really tickled my fancy to sort of spend an afternoon. And yet I've been to the Transport Museum. I definitely think, because I loved it. So I don't know.
I mean, I'm not the best person with like buses and like the actual science side of the underground. I'm just like, it's just so over my head. But from a graphics perspective, they have got so much cool stuff there. Like I know they did an exhibition a couple of years ago, and it was 150 years of underground art. And then I think they also did another one, which was just about the female poster designers that they'd had over the years. So definitely from a graphics perspective, they have so much going on, and I definitely recommend visiting. It's so cool. But as we said, we're not sponsored at all.
Telly, I have loved talking to you so much. Thank you for coming on and sharing this amazing story about this really iconic thing, which, as we've said, has been world reaching and has changed how people view not just transport maps, but how people interact with transport every day. And we've all been there, where when it works, transport's amazing, and when it doesn't, it's a nightmare. But on more than one occasion, even now having lived in London for 7 years, this map has completely saved my bacon. If I've been trying to get to an artist's studio for very early in the morning, and there's been a delay or a line suddenly shut down, and it's very easy just to look at this map and go, okay, I can do X, Y, Z, and it'll get me there in time. I love
Definitely.
it. I think it's great.
Couldn't agree more.
I've got one more question, and then I will let you go. So normally I ask people at the end of my podcast, why is art important? But as you are a designer and a graphic designer, I'm going to ask you, why is graphic design important?
Without graphic design, we would be completely lost. Like, everywhere you look, something has been designed, whether it be graphics, whether it be furniture design, interior design, product design. I think so. Yeah, not just specifically to graphics, but I think everywhere you look, every single thing that we use every day has been designed in some form. And I think if we didn't have design as a whole, I think life would be, we wouldn't know life as we know it now. Like, life would be so much more difficult, because we'd probably still be stuck in the dark age. We're probably still stuck in the dark ages with, like, in terms of how technology's developed, how we see the world, how we, like, everything has been designed that we look at. And I think without design, it would be a very, very different world. And I think for the better, we need to have design in our lives, whatever form of design it is. There needs to be design in order for us to, I think, just process as humans.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you so much. That was beautifully answered. And I think it's so important. And people, like we said right at the start of this, something like the underground map is something you see every day, you interact with, or you've seen at some point when you come to London, and you take it for granted. Even the maps that you use on your train lines, wherever you're listening to this from now, they've all been designed for a user-friendly experience. And everything has been designed, the chair that you're sitting on, the phone or the device that you're listening to this on, someone has sat down at some point and had to design that. And it makes your life better. That's why it's in your life. It improves your life in some way. And I think, particularly in 2020, when the government launched that creatives reskill thing, which was a total slap in the face. It was the one about the ballerina, Fatima, the dancer. And some absolute legend on Instagram went in and picked out, for that poster even to be designed, they needed all these different creative people to even get that campaign off the ground. So I think it's something that it's the thing that's hidden in plain sight that we champion the least and that we appreciate the least. So I completely agree with you. It's such an important thing.
Definitely. I think it's just fundamental to how I think, especially in an age where we now rely so much on technology and we rely so much on getting about, and the world is so much more accessible to us. I think it's so important that things are designed, like, because we just wouldn't be able to do half the things that we could if design wasn't a thing. So it's definitely very, very necessary, I think.
Telly, once again, thank you so much. Where can people
so I've got my design
Instagram,
which is at TJHcreative_, but I apologize, it is really it's not updated very often, because obviously I've got my design job, and then that's just like things that I do like in my own time, normally typographic things. So I'm definitely still on it all the time, but it's not updated as much as I would like it to be. But that's where people can find me.
Amazing. And I will leave a link to that in the chat below as well. Once again, I have loved this. Thank you so much for introducing me and my lovely art history listeners to Harry Beck. I would say to everyone, there's a wealth of material about, the history of the underground, the history of design. I'll leave links to all these things in the show notes below. And if you're watching on YouTube, just scroll down, it'll be there as well. But lastly, thank you
Thank you, and
once
thank
again.
you so much for having me on the
have a
podcast
really
as well.
good
It's
day.
been a joy to discuss the map. So thank you for having me on.
And there you have it, the end of another episode of the Jo's Art History podcast. Once again, thank you so much to Tilly for coming on and speaking so brilliantly about Harry Beck and the incredible design history around the London Underground Chipmap. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. I learned so much speaking to Tilly about this, and I really hope you've enjoyed listening and that you've learned a thing or two about this iconic piece of design. If you'd like to get in touch about anything that you heard today, please feel free to do so. You can email me, joesarthistory@gmail.com, or you can get in touch with me via Instagram @joesarthistory. My DMs are always open, and it's really lovely always to hear from people who've enjoyed the episode, learnt a little something, or even people that have passed it on to their friends, which I also encourage you to do. And hey, if you come talk to me over on Instagram, why not give me and Tilly a little follow as well? Our handles are in the show notes below. As always, any images that we've discussed today, and this was all very image heavy based, I do understand, you can find them on my highlights reel of my Instagram page. You can go to at the top, find number 32, which is this episode, and all the images will appear in the order that we spoke about them. You can also watch this podcast on YouTube, and if you are watching this on YouTube, why not hit that subscribe button and that like bell, please, and thank you. Finally, I've been Jo McLaughlin, your resident host and friendly art historian, and I look forward to welcoming you next time on the Jo's Art History podcast. Until then, keep learning, and remember, art is for all. Bye.